Okay, I am Claire Mabey, and this recorded Zoom conversation is a special extra addition to the Aspiring Conversations Festival that happened a couple of weekends ago down in Wanaka in the South Island. I'm the books editor of the spin-off and the founder of Verb Wellington. And I'm extremely lucky to be talking with Claire Keegan, a master of fiction and the author of breathtaking stories that have taken the world by the lapels. If you are in New Zealand and listening or watching, you will know this book, Small Things Like These, because it has not left the best-selling charts for many, many months. And you will know So Late in the Day because it has also not left the charts for many, many months. Small Things Like These is the story of one man's very big decision in the face of a terrible truth. It won the Kerry Group Irish Novel of the Year Award and the Orwell Prize for Political Fiction and was shortlisted for the Booker Prize in 2022. You may know the story Foster, which won the Davy Burns Award and was chosen by the Times as one of the top 50 works of fiction to be published in the 21st century. Claire's collection Antarctica won the Rooney Prize for Irish Literature, and her collection Walk the Blue Fields won the Edgehill Prize, awarded to the finest collection of stories published in the British Isles. So we're very lucky to be speaking with Claire today. Claire, I wanted to just ask you a question that was in the event description for the Aspiring Conversations Festival, and that was a question around why Irish writing is having such a moment right now. And I just wondered, to me, that seems like a quite a complex statement, and I wondered if you think Irish writing is, or if it's part of a very long tradition of Irish writing having a moment, but what might be contributing to these stories really surfacing for readers all around the world at the moment.
Well, I'd just like to say hello to everybody and thank you so much for having me and inviting me on today. I'm probably the wrong person to ask with regard to knowing anything about contemporary fiction, because really I read the dead. So I read Turgenev and Chekhov and Emily Dickinson and Elizabeth Bishop, and the joke amongst my students, which isn't very funny, is that so-and-so, such and such a writer is dead. You can read him now, Claire. So I really am up to date on what is fashionable or in or out, or very knowledgeable at all about contemporary Irish fiction. But I'm not sure that Irish fiction hasn't always been good or part of the literary scene. It just feels that the writers I would have read when I was young, who were, a generation older than me, people like, John McGahern and Edna O'Brien, William Trevor, Dermot Healy, all of these wonderful writers. I don't know that we're any better than they are. So if we're having a moment, I don't know, maybe it's a fashion blip. Maybe it's deserved. Maybe it doesn't matter. Maybe it doesn't matter where good books come from. Who writes them? As long as people are reading and getting pleasure out of books.
Yeah.
And developing a thoughtfulness over what they read. You see, I'm neither nationalist nor patriot. I'm not really interested in being Irish or being an Irish writer. It just happens to be where I was born and the culture I was brought up in. But it's lovely to hear that. It's lovely to know that that people are reading what the Irish are writing at the moment.
They really are, and there's a lot of conversation in New Zealand about Irish stories, and even though many of them come from contemporary writers, I suppose the subject matter often feels historic. And part of me wonders whether the conversation is about the telling of stories where perhaps there used to be more silence.
More silence in writing or more silence in speech and in general?
I suppose I'm thinking about the church, and in particular, your book, Small Things Like These, which does tell that story of the Magdalene laundries, or at least uncovers the glimpse of that truth. And I think that is very compelling for perhaps for a culture like New Zealand, where there was an Irish diaspora population who came here and are still attached to that history, which perhaps still feels very much like a contemporary history.
I'm not sure that I can, again, I'm not sure that I can measure that. I'm not sure how much silence there was. I know there was a great deal of fear, which people aren't afraid of the priest anymore. People were
Yeah,
genuinely afraid of the priest before, of what he could do, and they were very powerful in the church, in the schools, in the hospitals. I mean, I'm not sure what date it was, but a woman wasn't allowed to have a cesarean section. They would break her pelvis to get the baby out. A lot of women were left lame because of that. Marital rape was legal here until 1991.
yeah,
So there's a lot of backwardness and misogyny in our society. And I suppose one of the fundamental ways that this was imposed was by shutting women up physically in the Magdalene laundries, but also verbally. A misogynist wants a woman to shut up.
mm.
That's what it comes down to. So, yeah, there was an awful lot of that. There was an awful lot of that. I was born in 1968, and things certainly have changed, and women have money and jobs, and they drive and have contraception. And I
Mm.
think it's a bit terrifying for some of the fellas to find all of these privileges and these pedestals being overturned.
Yeah, incredible. Although I recently was lucky to talk to Audrey McGee, who did let us know about the referendum to try and overturn the piece of legislation that says a woman's place is in the home, and that referendum failed. And I did find that incredibly shocking, but perhaps it isn't so shocking. Perhaps there is a backlash to the other freedoms.
Oh yes, I think so. And this assumption that things are improving and evolving and getting better, and we're becoming more civilized between the sexes. I'm just not sure when such a misogynist as
Mm.
Donald Trump is kind of head of the free world. It's extraordinary the amount of support a very obvious woman hater has been given by the women in the United States who voted for him. And he
Mm.
said the most hateful things on record, which were recorded and in public about women. So I'm not sure, if somebody like FDR or Truman, or if those people, when they were running for election, had represented themselves in that way and said things like that about women, I'm not sure that the people back then in the 1930s and 40s or 50s would have wanted the head of state to be, and their commander in chief to present himself in that manner.
Mm.
And yet here we go again.
Yeah,
Mr. Trump.
the cycles of misogyny are so incredibly strong. Well, I think I would love to talk about this more in relation to So Late in the Day. And I wondered if you would be happy to read a little from that. Um, from this
Yes,
to lead us
of
in.
course. This is about a man, a civil servant, a dull civil servant, I'll call him. Chekhov writes about good, dull civil servants. He writes well, I should have said, about dull civil servants. But this is a civil servant, and it's just the story of him going to work on a Friday and coming home and kind of facing into what the day could have been. His name is Cathal. After a while, he put his head down on the cushions, which felt soft, and let his mind fall into a series of difficult thoughts, which he labored over. At one point, something from years ago came back to him. His mother standing at the gas cooker making buttermilk pancakes, turning them on the pan. His father was at the head of the table, with himself and his brother seated on either side. Both were in their 20s at that time, in college, and had gone home for the weekend with their laundry. His mother had served everyone, brought their plates to the table, and they had begun to eat. When she went to sit down with her own plate, his brother had reached out and quickly pulled the chair from under her, and she had fallen backwards onto the floor. She must have been near 60 years of age at that time, as she had married late. But his father had laughed, all three of them had laughed, heartily, and had kept on laughing while she picked the pancakes and the pieces of the broken plate up off the floor. If a part of Cathal now wondered how he might have turned out, if his father had been another type of man and had not laughed, Cathal did not let his mind dwell on it. He told himself it meant little, that it was just a bad joke. When he no longer felt able or inclined to think over or consider anything more, he turned on his side. But at least another hour must have passed before sleep finally reached out, and he felt himself falling into its relief and a new darkness.
Thank you so much, Claire. It's such a devastating scene and is very kind of crucial in the story because we see the influence of the behavior of Cahill's father, which is woven throughout the story on his own idea and expectations of marriage. But I wanted to ask you, I read back through a lot of your early stories and really saw this pattern of writing about women's lives within the institution of marriage. And is it fair to say that that has been an investigation in your work, the state of marriage, particularly for women?
Yes, I think so. I'm interested in why people just assume you should get married and have children. You're regarded as suspect here if you're not married and you don't have children. Most people don't even consider that as something they could do or could not do. It's just, you're brought up to, even children, will talk about getting married and having children, and in a way that seems, I don't know, distasteful to me. And it's just something you must do when we live in an overpopulated world.
Mm.
And also, I mean, we came out of a generation, which itself came out of a generation of unwanted children because we had no contraception. People were poor. They had children they couldn't afford. This is handled very well in a film by Mike Leigh called Vera Drake.
Brilliant movie.
And there's a wonderful character in that, played by Eddie Marsan, and he says one of the most tactful and beautiful things I've ever heard anyone say at a very awkward moment for the family. And he says, if you can't feed them, you can't love them.
Mm. It's
And sorry,
no, you go.
a lot of children I went to school with were hungry. There were just too many. I mean, my best friend Loretta, I think there were 11 in her family.
Mm.
So
It's
why just why you just assume that that's what you do. You go out then and have a big family, is and that is happiness, seems to me a failure of intelligence.
Mm. And yet again and again, that kind of hypocrisy of the church teaching, which, you know, supposedly cares for all children and loves children, and yet would suffer mothers and suffer children consequently, which is another theme in your work, I suppose, is an investigation of the lives of children and how neglect can happen in that same state.
Yes, I think my concern for children in our society is all over my work. I think it is a great concern.
But in this book, I guess crucially, and this is a spoiler, but I have to say it, but crucially, the marriage does not happen. And that is a moment of real relief for anyone reading who has seen inside Cahill's expectation of what a woman in his house is supposed to be like and do, and what they're supposed to do for him. And I wondered then, is because this is in a way, I think, the most contemporary story that I remember of yours. And I wondered if it is a story of times changing and of hope that fewer marriages will take place and fewer women will be trapped.
Well, the hope is that the misogynist will become so unattractive that he won't be able to mate and reproduce. That is the hope.
Mm.
And he'll be left on the shelf. That is the hope.
Yeah. He is.
But I think my work is more comical than anybody else thinks my work is.
Well,
I actually there's a real comic to that story as to, why guys like that get married and do reproduce.
yeah,
My
yeah.
father did.
What is the appeal? And the kind of comedy in this story is that there's nothing appealing about him. And luckily, Sabine sees that in the end, or is helped by a kind of, like a good friend, a good lady friend.
Mm. Yeah, I think sometimes we really just want to find out that we're right. And
Mm,
sometimes we do something painful and go through with it just to find out that we were right, that
mm,
it wasn't. And maybe that's part of what she was doing there. If she hadn't moved in with him, I don't know that she would ever have found out.
mm. And I mean, I did find it amused me a lot that his occupation was as some kind of administrator for a funding body. And I found his dreary emails very familiar. Unfortunately, your application has been declined. The style of email is very funny. And so is that where the influence of that kind of dull civil servant comes from?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know that most jobs are very exciting. Most people go to work and have dull swathes of time during the week and get paid for doing those dull things. And I just felt that suited Carl's personality.
Mm.
And also working as a civil servant. I mean, the joke over here, I think nobody's ever been fired from the county councils over here. I know this was true some years ago anyway, and it may have changed since then. But I think the only reason why anyone was ever fired from county council jobs was because of fraud. They were convicted of fraud. Anything else, you didn't lose your job. So it's kind of a job, a pensionable job for life. And, everybody tries to slow everybody else down so they don't show up anyone who's kind of fast and efficient. So I felt that would suit Cahill and kind of his laziness, because he's lazy. He's lazy and mean, and they both go together quite often
Mm,
lazy and mean
mm,
are often comrades in a personality.
mm. And unimaginative. There's no kind of I mean, there's one point in the story where I almost had hope for him, where he does somewhat reflect that other's voice is in his head. And I thought, well, at least you're recognizing that. But then in the end, he does nothing about it. He's lazy. You're right. He does not change his ways. He does not kind of battle that very hard at all.
No, indeed. No, he's a fairly ordinary fella.
Mm. Well, I loved that story and was very happy the marriage never happened. So to turn into small things like these, which has just been an enormous I mean, I don't know anyone who hasn't read this book in New Zealand, and I don't know everyone in New Zealand.
Well, that's delightful. How lovely.
But one thing that I wanted to ask you about it, which is a question that makes me nervous, but a lot of people talk about this book as this kind of warm and hopeful story because of the kindness of Bill Furlong, who is a kind man. But I find myself haunted by his decision in the end because I felt like in the story we see how he has made it somewhat in life. He has his daughters in the school and they're doing fine. They can buy the Christmas presents and they can feed their children. But the consequence of his bringing the girl home really terrifies me. And I wondered, am I right? Am I right to be haunted by that decision and feel slightly less? I suppose to me, it almost seems like a catastrophe for everybody else. Maybe it satisfies Bill's need to do the right thing, but is it the very wrong thing for everybody else?
Well, I mean, I can't tell you if you're right or wrong. It's your own interpretation, and the reader completes the book. Mm, but I do think it's possible that he has jeopardized his marriage, his family life, and his business
Hmm.
by going against the church. I mean, it's possible that Eileen might cover it up. She might say, "Well, we just brought the girl in for uh, Christmas Eve, and then left her back, after Christmas." She'd probably mend it up and stitch it up that way.
Oh, that's
Uh,
good. I think I might have
But
to.
I did, yeah, I think she's very pragmatic
Hmm.
and more able, if you like, for society than Bill is. But I did feel very genuinely that the marriage was in trouble when he bought the shoes, and she
Hmm.
put them side by side in the box and put the lid on it. And I felt that was a coffin on the marriage, and it wasn't something I devised. It just kind of surfaced in the material that I was working with. So I felt then that the marriage was in trouble. And really, he only went back to the shed, as far as I'm concerned, to make sure the girl wasn't there. He
Yeah.
wanted to be right. Again, a lot of things we do them because we want to be right. And he wanted to be right in believing that she would not be there. And of course, she was there. So there are things we simply cannot resist. And maybe that's part of what makes us who we are. And
Hmm.
it's interesting what one can resist and another cannot.
Hmm. That's, I mean, the whole story is incredibly. I've heard you say that you do a lot of drafts for your work. I mean, your stories are perfect. Every word is meaningful. But for a story like this, I mean, do you remember when you first learned about the Magdalene laundries? And I just wondered when this story lodged, where it grew from.
I would say I didn't learn about the Magdalene laundries until about 15 years ago
Oh, wow.
when it was exposed. Yeah, not earlier than that. Certainly not when I was a child. Although I do remember I went to New Orleans when I was 17, and apparently a neighbor of mine, I went when I finished secondary school, high school, and apparently a neighbor of mine said about me that I hadn't gone to, well, it was a very unusual thing to do for a farm girl to go off like that. But she did say about me that I hadn't gone to America at all.
Oh,
And
wow.
and the suggestion was that, yeah, the suggestion was that I must have been gone off somewhere, but I did not. My mother told me that, but I did not know I still did not know what she was referring to.
Gosh.
But it would have been a pregnancy. I would have been in trouble,
Mm,
according to the neighbor, but not. I still wouldn't have known that a Magdalene Laundry was a place to go.
mm,
And I never would have heard my mother or my friends talking about anything like that. But the girls would not have known about them. They would have been placed in them and then not been able to get out and, distribute the news that these places
mm,
exist.
mm.
Else they would have been too frightened to talk about it. And a lot of girls would have gone to England as well to get away.
Wow. I mean, it's so shocking. And I've read a little about the statistics of just the volume of dead babies and dead mothers. And I suppose it must have contributed to the decline of the Catholic Church. I mean, has the Catholic Church fallen as far as what it appears from this side of the
Yes.
world?
Yes, I think so. If I'm not sure how much you think it's fallen, but yes, it has collapsed. The
Wow.
power of the church has collapsed in this country, which is a wonderful thing because if it's rebuilt, maybe it can be rebuilt on something Christian and Christian ethics rather than the perversions of Catholicism Irish style. It also took away affection from people.
Mm,
I mean, the French, the Italians, the Spanish, they have a Catholic background, but they don't have this lack of affection or this fear of sex. They're very affectionate, sensual people, and we are not. And that's the Catholic Church. It's just, that leads to sexuality, and yet we were encouraged to have more and more children. So
mm,
all of that, and then the unmarried mothers. One thing is for certain, and that is that those women and girls did not impregnate themselves.
exactly. And yet, and there's just no, I mean, that's the horrible hypocrisy of the whole thing is men have been able to do really what they like with women and children for a very long time. And yet there's no joy or the outcome of that misogyny for men seems horrific too. I mean, when you look at young boys and the potential of young boys. And I suppose thinking about so late in the day when I had my moments of empathy with Cahill, I it was in seeing the legacy of masculinity that he had grown up in.
Mm.
So
But that's not masculinity. I think it's misogyny. I
yeah,
don't I don't
yeah.
think that's masculinity.
Mm,
I think masculinity probably has something to do with manliness, which is the
mm,
opposite of what he is.
mm. In in your story, Walk the Blue Fields, which I really loved for its perspective on marriage, but also its I suppose the a glimpse of one priest, just one man's life. But what struck me hard about the story is the insight of his appraisal of nature as God And it made me look at the rest of your work in quite a different way, I suppose, in terms of the role of land and farming. That seems to kind of be the backdrop and the backbone of a lot of these stories, like that dictates the way people live, the kind of the women at home at the farm and the men doing the farming. And is that fair that the kind of rural lives, but also the nature of the land is a big feature of your writing?
Yes, I'm sure it is. I was brought up on a farm and I like farming, and I've just bought a little farm here. So
Mm.
um yes, I think that that's my way of looking at the seasons and looking at the world, and I've always liked livestock, and particularly horses and cattle and pigs and sheep. I'm going down to Queensland the day after tomorrow to um,
Oh, wow.
train a train a wild Brumby, as I did last year. They round up some of the Brumbies down there every year and go to a ranch in the Brisbane Valley, and we all start a Brumby and rehome it. So that's something
Wow.
I've had. It's a project I've been doing for a few years now.
That's incredible. We have wild horses here too that are in need of homes. If you need if you need another destination for horses.
That sounds lovely.
I wonder another thing about the land relating to misogyny is in a couple of stories I picked up this a conversation about ownership of land for women, and I wondered what the background is. So in the story A Long and Painful Death, the character, who is a writer, picks up a newspaper and reads a fragment of a story that says, just this week, 80% of Irish farmers said they would be in favour of legal prenuptial agreements which would prevent their wives having any rights to their land. And then there's in another story, Surrender, there's just a line and it says, as it turned out, there was hardly a woman in the entire district with land. And then it really made me think about small things like these and the way that the woman who basically saves Bill and his mother has land. And it just struck me that this history of prevention of land ownership and stopping women from having their own control over where they lived and what they had contributed to this kindness and small things like these. But I
Yes,
suppose.
well, he was loved, and he wasn't brought up in a misogynistic household. He
Mm,
was brought up to respect women, and he
mm,
was brought up by a respectable woman. And even though he lost his mother when he was young, he had his mother's love for years.
mm,
And Ned was kind, and that was his father figure, if
mm.
not his father.
Yeah.
So, even though I did not know that. So, um, yes, I feel that that was part of, and a good part of his development. And the reason why I wanted to put it in the book was I think that's what made him do, if you will, what he does. That's
Mm,
what he was brought up to do.
mm.
He was brought up to do the right thing.
Yeah. And were there laws stopping women from owning land in Ireland?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Without doubt. Yeah, my mother, for example, would not have owned any of the land at home. She had a right of residence, that's all,
Wow.
having raised 6 children on 53 acres.
Mm. It's shocking the layers of control. I feel like that's what I have got through a lot of your work is understanding how the misogyny intersects with every point of a woman's life.
And a man's life as well.
Mm.
So it changes the classroom, it changes the home, it changes what happens in the bedroom, it changes conversation, it
Mm.
changes the workplace. Nothing is as it could be
Mm.
um, without generosity.
Mm.
And I think a lack of generosity is the failure at the heart of it, not wanting to share what is there.
Yeah.
No good comes of it.
There's another kind of comedic aspect that I found in your work is in the story The Long and Painful Death, which I loved a lot because it's about a writer, a woman alone in this writer's cottage, having a good time and doing whatever she likes until the professor shows up and really interrupts. And I wondered, it's very funny, and then you see her revenge, I suppose, being enacted at the end through what she chooses to write about this very similar character. But I just wondered where the story came from. And it was interesting to me that he was a professor and that he comes from this dusty institution. And I suppose it made me wonder what you think about institutions and academia and that kind of a hierarchical structure, and whether that too is another realm of misogyny that's hopefully changing, but has impacted women's freedoms nonetheless.
Well, I don't really have a great deal, even though I've held several residencies in universities here in Ireland and abroad. I don't have a great deal to do with academic life, and I don't think about my stories in the terms the academics do. And I find a great deal of it can take the good out of the work and the pleasure out of it. And when I've been teaching creative writing for 30 years in literature, and I love doing that. And actually, I'm running a fiction workshop in Brisbane at the end of the month. But I just I talk about how stories work and how they're put together and the people in them and the dialogue and the point of view, but not in the way that academics do. And so I'm not quite sure what you're asking me. I'm sorry.
That's okay. I guess I just wondered where that story in particular came from and whether it was
Oh.
about.
Well, it came from the same place that all of my work does, really. I just make it up. I try and find something truthful at the heart of something I'm interested in exploring and looking at, and then devising, using a place, usually a place I know, and I do know that house in Achill Island, where Heinrich Boole worked. And I decided to set it there because I was there at the time and I was doing a writer's residency, and I just wanted to, I often go there. And so I decided that I'd set a story there, and I hadn't been writing and I really needed to write. So I just made up this story and set it in the house on Achill Island, which is a beautiful, beautiful place.
When you say you needed to write, have you always been like that? Have you always been someone who has had to write?
I think it's my way of being able to see and understand. Even if you ask me to spell something, sometimes I'll have to write it down and look at it before I can tell you how to spell it. So if I see it written down, there's both a closeness and a distance which emerge. These things emerge, and I look at it differently because I have written it down, and then I can adjust it. And I think that that's an attractive part of writing, that you can change it. You can't change what you say. And it's lovely that you have the drafts and they'll save you. You've got all these safety nets between you and publication. And if you don't want to publish it, you don't have to.
Is there much that you don't publish?
Not anymore. Not anymore. Now I stay with something until it's finished and I let it turn into what it needs to turn into. And I don't talk about it while I'm doing it, which is helpful.
Is that because you need to keep it between you and the story until? Yeah. I noticed in the acknowledgements, I think it's for So Late in the Day, you thank your students for teaching you. And I just wondered what kind of lessons teaching does offer you?
Oh, I've learned so much from teaching over the years. I mean, I've had really problematic manuscripts come into me, and I've got to show up in front of a group of people with the author there and tell them why it isn't working and how to fix it tactfully and honestly.
Yeah.
I know some creative writing teachers just say, take the money and tell them they're doing great. And I can't do that. And I won't do that. But it's easier. There's no question, but it's easier. But I won't do that. And I really try and keep the bar high, which has got nothing to do with perfectionism. It has to do with shining and trying to dig deep and do your best. Um, so what have they taught me? They've taught me that, a reaction is not a response. Saying I don't like it is useless. You've got to find a creative and critical and encouraging response to what is not working. And then you can actually take that home to your own self as well. So I learned a great deal about paragraph structure by rewriting a whole lot of paragraphs, which needed to be rewritten in my students' work. I learned a great deal about point of view. I learned almost everything I know about narrative structure and the difference between short stories and novellas and novels. I learned about syntax and exaggeration and the differences between suggestion and statement. I've been studying manuscripts, student manuscripts for 30 years. I no longer criticize student manuscripts because the groups coming now are just really, really too big. But it's wonderful because I get to do the same thing with authors who are not there, who are dead, whose writing we study, and we can all talk about them and offend nobody. So it's great.
That's wonderful. So, if there was one story from a dead writer that you would recommend for hopeful, aspiring writers to read, what would it be?
Oh, that's a terrible question. That's an awful
You
question.
could give more than one.
One. Well, I can't help thinking that if you studied Reunion, the John Cheever story,
Oh yeah.
and you transcribed it by hand, it would be a very useful thing to do. And again, if you were trying to write some dialogue and maybe you transcribed a Raymond Carver story by hand, writing it by hand, it means that you've actually written it. That's how George Orwell taught himself to write. He transcribed the works of others by hand. His friend said he never saw anyone work so hard on teaching himself how to write. And that's how Orwell taught himself how to write, and it works. It really does work.
Wow. Is that because it gives you the rhythm of someone's style?
It might have something to do with that, but I don't think that's what it does. It primarily does for you. What it will do is, so let's say you read a sentence, and it could be a fairly long sentence, or it may not be, and you look away and you turn over to your page that you're writing it down on, and you write it down. And then you look back at the sentence and you realize that you changed the syntax or you didn't put the comma in the place it was in. And that's how you learn. That's how you learn. If you're just a touch typist and you're looking at it and you're not looking at your keyboard and you're just typing it up, that isn't going to work. It's not the same process or anything close to it. But to transcribe work is very useful, and most people won't do it.
Yeah, that's a really good tip. I'm going to try transcribing. Well, we still, oh yeah, we just had a slight pause. Well, we're running out of time, but I wanted to ask one final question, which is around reactions to your work. And I wondered if you'd ever, I suppose if you'd ever had reactions to your work that surprised you in a good or bad way. Or what have been, I suppose, the most satisfying reactions?
It's all been a surprise. It's all been a delightful surprise to think that somebody who grew up on a farm with no books
Mhm.
and didn't really go to secondary school because I just couldn't bear secondary school. She'd wind up, having 40 publishers and bestsellers all over the world, and people really interested in the stories I write is just delightful. It is all a surprise. It is all a marvelous surprise, and I'm grateful. I'm grateful for all of it. I'm most grateful to my readers.
Mm. Well, I have loved reading your stories. They've just I know I can go back and find new things in every one of them. And I have heard you say famously that you do 40 upwards of 40 drafts for each story, and I find that incredibly inspiring. I wonder if many new writers work that hard. And
I think if manuscripts could sing, they would sing the song "You Left Me Just When I Needed You Most."
that's brilliant. Right.
Just when things get tough, that's when people stop and send it out, and that is absolutely the time to not stop and not put it in a drawer, and don't send it out. Just stay with it. Just keep it company for another 10 drafts. Flannery O'Connor did 30 drafts, so surely we should do far more than that, don't you think?
Yeah. Yeah. Flannery had to do 30. Yeah, that makes sense. It's a good equation. Thank you so much, Claire. That is
You
it's a real treat to talk to you. I feel very honored and lucky. Your work is
must talk.
very loved in New Zealand.
Thank you. And thank you to your listeners, your viewers. Bye-bye, everybody.
Goodbye, Claire. Have fun
Bye-bye.
in Brisbane.
Thank you. Thank you. I will.